You probably noticed something strange in the Old Testament. I mean, if you're reading it, you probably noticed a lot of strange things in the Old Testament. But we're going to focus on one in particular. God creates one man, one woman, Adam and Eve. And then a few chapters later, everybody seems to be having multiple wives. Abraham, Jacob, David, Solomon. So what happened? Because if marriage was supposed to be one man and one woman, why does the Old Testament keep showing us polygamy? And here's the bigger question. Did God actually approve of it? Because if you misunderstand this, you're going to misunderstand a huge amount of what you're reading. First, let's clear something up. The Bible records many, many things. That does not mean the Bible endorses them. Recording them does not mean endorsing them. And people get this wrong all the time. The Bible records murder. It records adultery. It records idolatry. It records betrayal. And it records polygamy. Recording something and approving of something are not the same thing. So where do we find God's design? Not in the middle of the story, at the beginning. In Genesis 2, before sin enters the world, God creates Eve. Not Eve, Rachel, Sarah, and Deborah. One woman, for one man. Then comes the famous line, "A man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Notice the language? Not wives, wife. This is the pattern. This is the design. This is the foundation. So, if that's the design, why does polygamy show up at all? Because the Bible is showing you real people, not perfect people. And once sin enters the world, people start making a mess of things fast. Here's something most people never notice. The first polygamist mentioned in the Bible isn't a hero. It's Lamech. Genesis chapter 4. A descendant of Cain. The very first man specifically described as having multiple wives comes from Cain's line. That's not a shocker. The line already moving away from God. That's interesting because right from the start, polygamy isn't introduced as an improvement. It's introduced as part of the world moving further from Eden. And then the pattern continues. Take Abraham. God promised him a son through Sarah, but Sarah becomes impatient. So Hagar enters the picture. What follows? Jealousy, conflict, division, heartbreak. The story doesn't end with everyone living happily ever after. It becomes complicated immediately. Then comes Jacob. Jacob loves Rachel, but he ends up married to Leah too. Then both women give servants to Jacob. And suddenly you've got 4 women involved in building one family. What follows? Competition, resentment, favoritism, constant tension. The Bible isn't hiding the consequences. It's putting them on full display. And then we reach David, a man after God's own heart. Yet David has multiple wives. and his household becomes one of the most dysfunctional families in Scripture. Sibling rivalries, power struggles, violence, rebellion, tragedy. Again, the Bible records it honestly, but it never says, this is what you should do. Then we arrive at Solomon, and this is where everything explodes. Solomon doesn't just have a few wives. He has hundreds and hundreds of concubines besides his wives. At that point, we're not even talking about marriage anymore. We're talking about power, politics, allegiances, status. And Scripture tells us exactly what happened. His wives turned his heart away from God. The wisest king in Israel, destroyed by the very thing God warned about. Do you see the pattern yet? Every time polygamy appears, it creates problems. Every single time. Not because God designed it that way, but because God is showing us what happens when people drift from his design. Now here's where many people get confused. They'll point out that the law of Moses contains regulations about multiple wives. And they're right, it does. But regulating something isn't the same as endorsing it. The law also regulates slavery, divorce, debt, warfare. Sometimes God gives laws to protect people living in a broken reality. That doesn't mean the broken reality is the ideal. And then Jesus settles the issue. When he's asked about marriage, he doesn't point to Abraham. He doesn't point to Jacob. He doesn't point to David. He points all the way back to Genesis, back to the beginning, back to God's original design. One man, one woman, one flesh. Because the goal was never to move away from Eden. The goal was to move back toward it. This is why understanding polygamy matters when you read the Bible. If you assume every action performed by a biblical character is approved by God, you're going to misread huge sections of Scripture. The Bible isn't a collection of flawless heroes. It's a collection of broken people. People who fail. People who compromise. People who make messes. And a God who keeps working through them anyway. And that's what you're seeing when you read these stories. Not God's ideal, but humanity's struggle to live up to it. So next time you see Abraham, or Jacob, or David, or Solomon with multiple wives, don't read it as God's definition of marriage. Read it as another reminder that even the greatest people in the Bible need God's mercy. Because the story isn't really about how faithful they were. It's about how faithful God was. When you see polygamy in the Old Testament, you're not guessing anymore. You understand what you're looking at. So, may the truth set us all free.